The rain hammered against Detective Sarah Chin's windshield-like accusations she couldn't escape. Each droplet caught the red and blue lights of the patrol cars, transforming the quiet suburban street into a kaleidoscope of emergency. She sat in her unmarked sedan for a moment longer than necessary, watching the chaos unfold through the distorted glass. 20-3 years on the force, 23 years of death scenes, grieving families, and sleepless nights. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the way dispatch had hesitated before giving her the address. Maybe it was the unusual silence on the radio afterward. Or maybe it was just the fact that Millbrook was supposed to be safe. Sarah finally stepped out into the deluge, her coat immediately soaked through. The house before her was a picture of middle-class normalcy: white picket fence, manicured lawn, children's toys scattered across the porch. A swing set in the backyard swayed eerily in the wind, its chains creaking a metallic lullaby. Detective Chen, young officer, approached, his face pale beneath his rain-soaked cap. "I'm Officer Martinez. I was first on scene." Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook. The pages were already damp. "Talk to me." An anonymous tip came in around 3 a.m. Caller said they heard screaming from this address. "We arrived to find the front door wide open." Martinez swallowed hard. "The family's inside. All of them." The officer's voice carried a tremor that made Sarah's stomach tighten. In 2 decades of police work, she'd learned to read between the lines of an officer's tone. This wasn't just another domestic dispute gone wrong. How many? 4. Parents and 2 kids. But Detective Martinez paused, looking toward the house. "You need to see this for yourself. It's not like anything we've dealt with before." Sarah followed him up the walkway, noting the perfectly maintained flower beds, the welcome mat that read, "Bless this home," the wind chimes that sang a haunting melody in the storm. Everything about the exterior suggested a family that cared about appearances. It's about creating a sanctuary from the world's chaos. The irony wasn't lost on her. The front door stood open like a wound. Sarah paused at the threshold, pulling on latex gloves and breathing in the familiar cocktail of death copper, fear, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Something medicinal, antiseptic. Inside, the scene was a study in contrasts. The living room was immaculate, as if prepared for a magazine photo shoot. Family portraits lined the mantelpiece, showing 4 smiling faces: Robert and Jennifer Hartwell, their daughter Emma, 12, and son Michael, 8. The American dream captured in silver frames, but the dream had become a nightmare. "They're upstairs," Martinez said quietly. The whole family." Sarah climbed the stairs slowly, her trained, cataloging details. No signs of forced entry, no obvious signs of struggle in the common areas. Whatever had happened here, it had been swift and precise. The master bedroom door was closed. Sarah paused, her hand on the knob, steeling herself for what lay beyond. She'd seen enough crime scenes to know that the worst ones often appeared, the most peaceful at first glance. She opened the door. Robert and Jennifer Hartwell lay in their bed, positioned as if they were sleeping. Their hands were folded across their chests, their faces serene. But the dark stains on the white sheets told a different story. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, almost overwhelming. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, moving closer. The victims. Wounds were precise, clinical. Single incisions across the throat, made with surgical precision. No hesitation marks. No signs of struggle, but it was the children's room that broke her. Emma and Michael lay in their respective beds, tucked in like they were being kissed goodnight. Someone had even turned on their nightlights, a princess lamp for Emma, a dinosaur, projection for Michael. The soft glow should have been comforting. Instead, it cast eerie shadows across their pale faces. "Detective?" Martinez's voice came from downstairs. "There's something else you need to see." Sarah forced herself to leave the children's room, her hands shaking slightly as she removed her gloves. Downstairs, Martinez was standing in the kitchen. Pointing to the refrigerator, held by a cheerful magnet shaped like a sunflower, was a single sheet of paper, neat, precise handwriting. Someone had written. The shepherd knows his flock. The first lamb has been chosen. More will follow. Let those who have ears to hear, hear. Sarah stared at the note, her blood running cold. Below the message was a small symbol, a simple drawing of a shepherd's crook. This wasn't a family annihilation, she said quietly. This was a message. Outside, the storm raged on, but Sarah barely noticed. She was thinking about the precision of the kills, the staging of the bodies, the cryptic note. This wasn't the work of someone in a rage or a moment of desperation. This was planned, methodical, and worst of all, it was just the beginning. The Hartwell family had been chosen for a reason. But why them? Who would be next? As she stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a normal family life, school permission slips, grocery lists, children's artwork, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 4 people were dead, and somewhere out there, a killer was already planning the next act in whatever twisted play they were performing. She pulled out her phone and dialed her partner, Detective Marcus Rodriguez. Marcus, it's Sarah. I need you. At 1247 Maple Street. And Marcus. She paused, looking once more at the note on the refrigerator. Bring the FBI liaison. I think we're going to need them. FBI Special Agent David Kane had seen his share of ritualistic murders. The behavioral analysis unit had trained him to look for patterns, to read the psychology behind the violence. But as he stood in the Hartwell kitchen at 6 a.m., coffee growing cold in his hands, he felt that familiar chill that came with encountering something truly aberrant. The positioning of the bodies suggests a comfort with death, Kane said, his voice clinical and detached. The killer spent time with them after. This isn't about rage or passion, it's about control. Detective Chen nodded, her dark eyes fixed on the note. The handwriting analysis came back preliminary. Right-handed, educated, possibly medical background based on the precision, but it's the message that concerns me. Kane studied the shepherd's crook symbol again. Biblical reference. The Lord is my shepherd, but twisted. The shepherd here isn't protecting the flock, he's selecting them for slaughter. So we're looking at a religious fanatic? Maybe. Or someone who thinks they're on a divine mission. Kane set down his coffee cup. The question is, what made the Hartwells targets? Detective Rodriguez, who'd been quietly examining the family. Photos looked up. I've been going through their social media, talking to neighbors. By all accounts, they were the perfect family. Robert worked as an accountant. Jennifer was a part-time teacher. Kids were honor students, involved in church activities. Church activities? Kane repeated. Which church? St. Mary's Episcopal. Been members for about 5 years, ever since they moved to Millbrook. Kane felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. We need to talk to their pastor and get me a list of all church members. The drive to St. Mary's took them through Millbrook's historic downtown, past antique shops and cafes that wouldn't look out of place in a Norman Rockwell painting. The church itself was a modest stone building with a bell tower and stained glass windows that caught the morning light like jewels. Reverend Thomas Whitmore was a man in his 60s, silver hair and kind eyes that looked like they'd seen too much sorrow. He met them in his office, surrounded by theological texts and photos of church events. The Hartwells, he said quietly, his hands folded in prayer position. I still can't believe they're gone. Robert was on our finance committee. Jennifer helped with the children's Sunday school. They were ... they were good people, Reverend Kane said gently. We need to ask about any conflicts they might have had. Anyone who seemed particularly interested in them, or who might have had a disagreement with them. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. There was something about 6 months ago. We had a new member join the congregation. A man named Simon Thorne. Oh, he seemed ... intense. Very knowledgeable about scripture, but his interpretations were ... troubling. How he would corner people after services, engage them in theological discussions that became increasingly uncomfortable. He had very specific ideas about sin, about judgment, about who was worthy of salvation. Whitmore paused. Jennifer came to me about him, said he'd approached her after a service, told her that he could see the sin in her family, that they needed to be cleansed. Kane and Chen exchanged glances. What did you do? I spoke with him. Tried to counsel him, but he became ... agitated. Said I was a false prophet, that I didn't understand the true nature of God's will. He stopped coming to services after that. Do you have an address for him? Afraid not. He never filled out a membership form, never gave us contact information. Just appeared one Sunday and kept coming for about 2 months. Kane pulled out his notebook. Can you describe him? Mid-40s, maybe early 50s. Average height, thin build. But it was his eyes that unsettled people. It's very intense, like he was looking right through you. And his hands, they were always perfectly clean, like he'd just scrubbed them. After leaving the church, Kane sat in the passenger seat of Chun's car, his mind racing. We need to canvass the neighborhood again. Someone had to have seen this. Simon Thorne's character. Already on it, Chen said, pulling out her phone. But David, there's something else. The coroner's preliminary report came back. The family was sedated before they were killed. Same drug used in all 4 victims. What drug? Midazolam. It's used in medical procedures. Causes amnesia and sedation. The killer wanted them unconscious, but alive when he positioned them. It came. Felt his blood run cold. He wanted them to look peaceful, like they were sleeping. Gets worse. The coroner found something under Robert Hartwell's fingernails. Fragments of what looks like communion wafer. The pieces were starting to form a picture that Kane didn't like. A religious fanatic with medical knowledge, targeting a family from his former church, positioning them like they were receiving some kind of twisted sacrament. Chen, I need you to contact every hospital, clinic, and medical facility in a 50-mile radius. Get me a list of anyone with access to midazolam who might match our description. You think he's medical? I think he's someone who believes he's performing a sacred duty, and in his mind, he's just getting started. As they drove back to the station, Kane couldn't shake the image of the Hartwell children, tucked into their beds like they were being kissed goodnight by death itself. The killer wasn't just methodical, he was compassionate in his own twisted way. He believed he was saving them. That made him infinitely more dangerous. Dr. Patricia Vance had been Milbert County's chief medical examiner for 15 years, and she'd learned to separate emotion from clinical observation. But as she stood over the body of 8-year-old Michael Hartwell, her professional detachment wavered. The incisions are textbook perfect, she told Kane and Chen as they observed the autopsy. Single pass, left to right, severing the carotid artery and jugular veins simultaneously. No hesitation marks, no sawing motion. Whoever did this has extensive knowledge of human anatomy. Kane studied the Y incision she'd made on the child's chest. What about the sedative? Midazolam was present in all 4 victims. Based on the concentration, they would have been unconscious within minutes of administration. The killer then had approximately 30 minutes to position them before the drug metabolized. Method of administration? Injection sites on the back of the neck, right at the base of the skull. Again, precise placement. The killer knew exactly where to insert the needle to hit the subcutaneous layer without penetrating muscle. Chen took notes, her jaw tight. Defensive wounds? None. They never saw it coming. Dr. Vance pulled back the sheet covering Jennifer Hartwell's body. But there's something else. Look at this. She pointed to small marks on the woman's forehead, barely visible unless you knew. What to look for? Anointing oil? The killer marked each victim with a cross before killing them. Kane felt his stomach turn. He gave them last rites. Gets stranger. I found traces of communion wine in their stomachs. Not enough to cause intoxication, just symbolic amounts. In these, she held up 4 small evidence bags, each containing what looked like pieces of paper. What are they? Scripture verses, rolled up and placed under each victim's tongue. Psalms mostly about shepherds and lambs. Kane examined the bags. Even through the plastic, he could make out the careful handwriting. He's not just killing them, he's preparing them for some kind of afterlife. The question is, Chen said quietly, what did this family do to deserve salvation in his mind? The answer came 3 hours later when Kane's phone rang. It was Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. David, I ran the details you sent through our database. We've got a potential match. Kane put her on speaker. What do you have? 3 similar cases over the past 5 years? Phoenix, Arizona, Burlington, Vermont, Jacksonville, Florida. All families, all killed in their homes, all positioned like they were sleeping. Same signature communion elements, scripture verses, anointing oil. Same killer, unknown. The local departments never connected them because they were spread out geographically and temporally. But the methodology is identical. I'm sending you the case files. Kane felt his pulse quicken. Any survivors? None. But David, there's something else. In each case, the families were members of churches where a man matching your Simon Thorne description had been seen. Different names, but same physical description. Same behavior pattern. He's been doing this for years. He's getting bolder. The time between kills is decreasing. Phoenix was 2 years before Vermont. Vermont was 18 months before Jacksonville. Jacksonville was 8 months ago. Kane did the math. He's accelerating. There's more. Each family had something in common beyond church membership. They all had recently moved to their communities. All were considered model families. All had children involved in church activities. Chen looked up from her notes. New members trying to integrate into the community. Perfect targets for someone who sees himself as a spiritual guide. But why kill them if they're doing everything right? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Vance, who'd been listening to the conversation, spoke up from across the room. I've been thinking about the positioning, the peaceful expressions. What if he doesn't see it as murder? What if he thinks he's saving them? Kane turned to her. Saving them from what? From the world, from sin, from the corruption he believes will inevitably claim them. She gestured to the bodies. Look at how he's positioned them, not as victims of violence, but as recipients of grace. He's sending them to heaven before they can fall. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't dealing with a killer driven by rage or psychosis. They were dealing with someone who believed he was performing acts of mercy. Jennifer Kane said into the phone, I need you to run a deeper analysis. Look for anyone with medical training who's moved frequently, possibly someone who's been asked to leave religious communities already on it. But David, there's one more thing you need to know. In each of the previous cases, the killer left a timeline. What kind of timeline? After the Jacksonville murders, police found a calendar in the victim's house. Dates marked in red ink. The Jacksonville murders fell on one of those dates. According to our analysis, the next date is in 4 days. Kane felt his blood run. Cold. He's not done. No. And based on the pattern, he's already selected his next family. The FBI task force had taken over the Millbrook Police Department's conference room, transforming it into a war room of crime scene photos, maps, and psychological profiles. Kane stood before a whiteboard covered in red string connecting various pieces of evidence, looking like a madman's conspiracy theory. 3 families across 3 states, he said, addressing the assembled team. All killed with the same methodology, all positioned the same way, all receiving the same ritualistic treatment. Agent Walsh had arrived from Quantico with a team of analysts. She pulled up a digital map on the laptop connected to the rooms. Projector. Phoenix, Burlington, Jacksonville, and now Millbrook. No obvious geographic pattern, but look at this. She clicked, and the map zoomed in on each location. Every single one of these towns has a population between 15,000 and 30,000. All have historic downtown areas. All are considered safe, family-friendly communities. Detective Chen studied the map. He's targeting a specific demographic, small town. America, places where people move to raise families safely. But why these specific families? Rodriguez asked. Out of thousands of possibilities in each town, what made them stand out? Kane pulled up the psychological profile they'd been developing. Our unsubknown subject displays characteristics of a mission-oriented killer. He believes he's been chosen for a divine purpose. The families aren't random victims. They're carefully selected based on criteria that make sense to him. What criteria? They're all newcomers to the community, actively trying to integrate. They join churches, volunteer for community events. Their children excel in school. They represent the American ideal of family values. Agent Walsh nodded. And that's exactly why he targets them. In his mind, they're pure, uncorrupted by the world around them. He's preserving that purity by killing them before they can be tainted. Room fell silent as the horror of the logic sank in. They were dealing with someone who saw murder as an act of love. Kane's phone buzzed. It was Dr. Vance. "David, you need to get down here. I found something in the Hartwell house that your team missed." 20 minutes later, Kane and Chen stood in the Hartwell kitchen while Dr. Vance pointed to a small, almost invisible mark on the refrigerator. "Right here, next to where the note was placed. It's a fingerprint, but it's been wiped clean. Whoever. Did this used alcohol or some kind of disinfectant? Can you lift it? It's partial, but it might be enough for a match if we get a suspect." She paused. "But that's not what I called you about. Look at this." She led them to the family computer, which forensics had already processed. On the screen was the family's email account. The killer had access to their email. He's been monitoring their correspondence for weeks, maybe months. "Look at these read receipts." Kane studied the screen. Emails from the church, from the children's school, from Robert's work, had been opened and read by someone other than the family members. He was studying them, Chen said quietly, learning their routines, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. Gets worse. "Look at this." Dr. Vance clicked on the sent folder. 3 emails sent from Jennifer Hartwell's account after the family was already dead. 2 people asking about their well-being, saying they were fine and going away for a few days. Kane felt his blood run cold. He's buying himself time, making sure no one comes looking for them. The emails were sent using a virtual private network to mask the IP address. But our tech guys traced it to a public library in the next county. Security footage shows a man matching our description using the computer. Did we get a clear image? All good. Enough for facial recognition. The system's running now. Kane's phone rang. It was Agent Walsh. "David, we've got a problem. The next date on the calendar is tomorrow night, not in 4 days." I misread the timeline. Kane felt his stomach drop. "Tomorrow? That's impossible. I don't even know who the next targets are. I'm afraid it gets worse. Based on the pattern analysis, the next family should be in Millbrook. He's not moving on to another town. He's staying local." Kane looked at Chen, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. Already selected them, and he's had weeks to prepare. "David, you need to start canvassing every church in the area. Look for families that match the profile recent arrivals, active in the community, children involved in church activities." Kane was already moving toward the door. "Chen, get me a list of every family that's moved to Millbrook in the past 2 years. Cross-reference with church membership rolls. What about the fingerprint? Keep running it. We can't wait for results. If we're right about the timeline, we have less than 18 hours to find the next family." As they drove back to the station, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The killer had been in this town for weeks, maybe months. He knew its rhythms, its secrets, its vulnerabilities. And somewhere in Millbrook, a family was going about their normal evening routine, unaware that they'd been selected for salvation. The thought made Kane drive faster, but he knew that speed wouldn't matter if they couldn't figure out the killer's selection criteria. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, and they were running out of time. The Millbrook police station buzzed with activity at 2 a.m. Officers worked phones, pulling records and cross-referencing databases. Kane stood at the center of it, all coordinating the search for a family that might not even know they were in danger. "I've got 17 families that moved to Millbrook in the past 2 years, Chen announced, spreading files across the conference table. All have children, all attend local churches. Agent Walsh looked up from her laptop. "We need to narrow this down. The killer is methodical. He won't deviate from his pattern." What made the Hartwells special? Kane studied the photos of the dead family. They were new enough to still be enthusiastic about community involvement, but established enough to have gained trust. The perfect balance of innocence and integration. "We're looking for families that moved here within the last year but have already become active in church and community activities," Rodriguez said. "Exactly. Based on the previous cases, the children will be between 6 and 14 years old. Old enough to be involved in church activities, young enough to represent innocence. Chen began sorting through the files. That eliminates about half of them, but we're still looking at 8 families. Kane's phone rang. It was the tech analyst running the facial recognition program. Agent Kane, we've got a match on the library footage. Simon Thorne is actually Dr. Simon Thorne, former trauma surgeon from Detroit. Lost his medical license 3 years ago. Kane felt a chill. What for? Allegations of inappropriate conduct during end-of-life care. Several families complained that he was performing unauthorized religious ceremonies on dying patients. The medical board found evidence that he was administering last rites without consent, sometimes against families' wishes. Where is he now? That's the problem. He disappeared after losing his license. No known address, no credit cards, no digital footprint. It's like he vanished. Kane hung up and turned to the team. Our unsub is Dr. Simon Thorne, former trauma surgeon. He's been off the grid for 3 years, which means he's been planning this for a long time. A surgeon would explain the precision of the cuts, Chen said, and the knowledge of human anatomy. And the access to midazolam, Walsh added. He could have stolen it from a hospital before disappearing. Kane looked at the files scattered. Across the table, you need to visit these families now. Before he makes his move, they split into teams, each taking several addresses. Kane and Chen drove to the first house on their list, the Morrison family. Recent arrivals from California, 2 children, active in St. Mary's Episcopal Church. The house was dark, but Kane could see a security system panel glowing red by the front door. He knocked, and after a few moments, a man in his 30s appeared. Looking concerned, Mr. Morrison? I'm Agent Kane with the FBI. We need to speak with you about a security threat. Morrison's face went pale. Is someone in danger? Possibly. Can we come in? The Morrison family listened with growing horror as Kane explained the situation. Their daughter, Emma, was the same age as the murdered Emma Hartwell. Their son, David, was only a year older than Michael. We'd like to offer you protection, Kane said, at least until we apprehend the suspect. Mrs. Morrison clutched her husband's hand. Really think he might target us? We can't take any chances. The pattern suggests he's already selected his next family, and you match the profile. By dawn, Kane's team had visited 6 of the 8 families. 5 had accepted protection, moving to a secure location arranged by the FBI. The 6th family, the Hendersons, had been more resistant. We appreciate your concern, James Henderson had said, but we're not going to be driven from our home by some madman. We have a security system, and I keep a gun in the house. Kane had tried to convince them, but Henderson was adamant. Besides, if this killer is targeting random families, what are the odds he'd pick us? Millbrook has thousands of families. Now, as Kane sat in the police station, watching the sun rise over the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something. The killer wasn't random. He was surgical in his precision, so there had to be a specific reason he chose each. Family, Agent Kane. Officer Martinez approached with a manila folder. The church records came in. I've been cross-referencing them with the families on your list. Kane opened the folder, scanning the membership rolls from various churches throughout the area. Most of the families appeared on multiple list church activities, school events, community volunteering, but one family appeared on every single list. Jesus, Kane whispered. Reaching for his phone, the Henderson family wasn't just active in the community. They were the most active family in Millbrook. James Henderson served on 3 different church committees. His wife Patricia volunteered at the school and ran the church's charity drive. Their children, 12-year-old Sarah and 9-year-old Tommy, were involved in youth groups at 2 different churches. They were perfect. Too perfect. Kane's call to the Henderson house went straight to voicemail.
Ow!
He tried James Henderson's cell phone, same result. Jen, he shouted across the room. We need to get to the Henderson house now. As they raced through the empty streets of Millbrook, Kane's mind replayed Henderson's words, "We have a security system, and I keep a gun in the house." Security systems could be disabled, and a gun was useless if you never saw the attack coming. Henderson House sat in perfect suburban tranquility, morning dew glistening on the manicured lawn. But Kane noticed immediately that the security system panel was dark. The front door was locked, but Kane could see through the window that the house was too quiet to still. "Chen, call for backup in the corner, and get Walsh here." Kane picked the Laka skill he'd learned early in his career and stepped inside. The house smelled of antiseptic and something else he was beginning to recognize: the scent of ritualistic death. The Henderson family was arranged in their living room, sitting around their dining table as if they were having breakfast. James Henderson sat at the head of the table, his wife beside him, their children across from them. All had been positioned to look like they were praying. On the table, 4 plates held communion wafers. 4 small cups contained wine, and in the center of the table, a note: "The shepherd has gathered his flock. The 4th offering is complete, but the work is not finished. The faithful must be preserved before corruption takes hold. More lambs await salvation." Kane stared at the note, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The killer wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Dr. Simon Thorne stood in the abandoned psychiatric hospital 30 miles outside Millbrook, staring at the wall he'd covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. For families, 16 souls, all saved from the corruption of the world. But his work was far from complete. The hospital had been empty for 3 years, ever since the state closed the facility. It was perfect for his purpose, scintillated, forgotten, with a basement that could be converted into a sanctuary. He'd spent months preparing it, installing medical equipment he'd acquired through various means, creating an environment where he could perform his sacred duty without interruption. The photographs showed families at church picnics, children playing in parks, couples holding hands as they walked through downtown Millbrook, normal scenes of American life. But Thorne saw deeper truths in each image. He saw an innocence that would inevitably be corrupted, purity that would be tainted by the world's evil, unless he intervened. Thorne had been chosen for this work 3 years ago, when he'd lost his medical license. The review board had called his actions inappropriate, but they hadn't understood his calling. When he'd administered last rites to dying patients, he'd been saving souls. When he'd whispered prayers over the unconscious, he'd been offering them a chance at redemption. But medicine had limited his reach. Surgery could only save the body. His true calling was to save souls. Sometimes salvation required sacrifice. The revelation had come to him gradually, through prayer and meditation. The families he'd chosen weren't random. They were the pure ones, the untainted ones, the ones who still believed in goodness and community and hope. They were the ones who would suffer most when the world inevitably corrupted them. Better to preserve them in their innocence. Better to send them to heaven while their souls were still clean. Thorne picked up a photograph of his next target, the Walsh family, the FBI agent, but a different Walsh family that had moved to Millbrook 8 months ago. Thomas Walsh worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. His wife, Rachel, was a nurse at the county hospital. Their daughter, Lily, was 10 years old and sang in the children's choir. Their son, Matthew, was 7 and played Little League baseball. They were perfect. Thorne had been watching them for weeks, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, their truths. Thomas Walsh left for work at 7:30 every morning. Rachel worked the night shift at the hospital 3 days a week. The children walked to school together, holding hands and laughing. They trusted the world, and they believed in its goodness. They had no idea how much they would suffer when that trust was inevitably broken, unless he saved them first. But as Thorne prepared for his next offering, he noticed something troubling. Police cars had been circling the Walsh neighborhood more frequently. FBI had discovered his work sooner than expected. He would have to accelerate his timeline. Thorne moved to his medical station, where he'd laid out everything he would need. The midazolam was already prepared in precise doses. The surgical instruments were sterilized and arranged in order of use. The communion elements waited in small silver containers he'd stolen from a church supply store. But tonight would be different. The authorities were closing in, which meant this might be his last opportunity to save a family. He would have to make it count. The Walsh family would have to wait. There was a larger offering he could make, one that would save many more souls. At once, Thorne knelt before the makeshift altar he'd constructed in the hospital's former chapel. Candles flickered in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He'd painted scripture verses in precise calligraphy. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The revelation came to him like a vision. The children's service at St. Mary's Episcopal Church. 23 young souls, all innocent, all pure, gathered in one place to worship God. If he could save them all at once, before the world could corrupt them, it would be the greatest act of mercy in human history. He prayed for guidance, for strength, for the courage to do what needed to be done. The children would resist. At first they always did. But once they understood his purpose, once they realized he was offering them salvation, they would be grateful. They would thank him for saving them from the world's corruption. Thorne opened his eyes and began to plan. The church would be filled with families, but the children's service took place in the basement chapel. He could isolate them there if he could work quickly and efficiently. He could save them all before anyone realized what was happening. It would be his masterpiece, his final gift to God. The hospital fell silent except for the sound of Thorne's breathing and the distant howl of wind through the broken windows. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another night of rain and darkness. Perfect weather for salvation. Kane's phone buzzed against his hip like an angry wasp. The caller ID showed Dr. Vance's number, but when he answered, her voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. "David, you need to get back to the morgue. Now." "What is it, Patricia?" "I've been running additional tests on the communion wine. Found in the victim's stomachs. It's not wine, David. It's blood." The words hit Kane like a physical blow. He looked at the Henderson family, still arranged around their macabre Last Supper, and felt his stomach lurch. Human blood. Yes. And David, ... It's not from the victims. It's someone else's blood entirely. Kane closed his eyes, trying to process the implications. He's making them drink his blood. Some kind of twisted communion. There's more. The blood type is AB negative. Less than 1% of the population has that type. We might actually be able to trace this. Kane was already moving toward the door. Start running it through the databases. Check medical records, blood banks, anywhere that would have that information on file. As Kane drove back to the morgue, his mind raced through the psychological profile they'd built. The killer saw himself as a shepherd, guiding his flock to salvation. But the blood communion added a new dimension. He wasn't just killing them, he was making them part of him, creating a permanent bond between shepherd and sheep. The morgue felt colder than usual when Kane arrived. Dr. Vance met him at the door, her face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "I've been thinking about the blood," she said, leading him to her office. A B negative is rare, but it's also the universal plasma donor. Someone with that blood type would be valuable to medical facilities. So our killer might be in the medical system? More than that. I ran the blood type through our local database. There's only one person in the county with a B negative blood who's had recent medical contact. She handed him a printout. The name at the top made Kane's blood freeze. Dr. Simon Thorne. He's been using his own blood in the communion, Kane said quietly, making them part of his body before he kills them. Like a perverted version of the Christian sacrament, Dr. Vance agreed. But David, there's something else. The blood samples show traces of medication. Specifically, someone's been trying to treat him for schizophrenia. Kane felt pieces clicking into place. He's been medicating himself, probably self-treating his delusions. But if he's stopped taking the medication, ... his condition would deteriorate rapidly. The delusions would become more vivid, more compelling. He'd lose whatever grip on reality he had left. Kane pulled out his phone and called Agent Walsh. "Jennifer, I need you to check something. Dr. Simon Thorne, former trauma surgeon from Detroit. I need to know if he was ever treated for psychiatric conditions. Already on it," Walsh replied. "And David, I've got some bad news. I've been analyzing the timeline of his kills. Pattern isn't random, it's accelerating exponentially. If I'm right, he's not planning to wait weeks or months for his next kill. How long do we have? Hours, maybe less. And based on the escalation pattern, the next target isn't going to be a single family. He's building towards something bigger. Kane felt his stomach drop. What kind of bigger? I don't know, but whatever he's planning, it's going to be his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he's been working toward. The abandoned Millbrook State Hospital loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to forgotten suffering. Kane stood in the parking lot, rain drumming against his jacket, studying the building through binoculars. 3 stories of brick and broken windows, with a bell tower that had once called patients to chapel services. Motion sensors picked up activity in the building 2 hours ago, Chen reported, joining him behind their surveillance van. But whoever's in there knows, we're here. The movement stopped as soon as we set up the perimeter. Kane lowered the binoculars. The building felt wrong, even from a distance. There was something malevolent about the way it sat in the landscape, as if it were feeding on the darkness around it. Any word from the blood bank records? He asked. That's the interesting part. Chen said, Dr. Simon Thorne has been donating blood regularly for the past 2 years. Always the maximum amount, always at different locations. He's been stockpiling his own blood. Kane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For how long? Long enough to perform his rituals on dozens of victims. David, I think. We've only seen the beginning of his work. Agent Walsh approached from the command vehicle they'd set up. I've been in contact with the Detroit PD. They're faxing over Thorne's psychiatric records from before he lost his medical license. What do they show? Paranoid schizophrenia with religious delusions. He was hospitalized twice for psychiatric evaluation after colleagues reported bizarre behavior. Both times, he claimed he was receiving divine visions about saving innocent souls from corruption. Kane studied the hospital building, and now he's stopped taking his medication. Gets worse, Walsh continued. The psychiatric reports mention specific delusions about children. He believed that children were the purest souls, the most in need of protection from the world's evil. His supervising physicians recommended he be kept away from pediatric cases. A radio crackled from the command vehicle. Agent Kane, we've got movement on the east side of the building. Looks like someone's watching us from the 3rd floor. Kane grabbed his binoculars and focused on the building. For a moment, he saw nothing but broken windows and shadow. Then, in one of the 3rd floor windows, a pale face appeared, even from this distance. Kane could see the intensity in the man's eyes. Dr. Simon Thorne stared back at them for a long moment, then disappeared into the darkness of the building. He knows we're here, Kane said, and he's not running, because he's not finished, Chen replied. Whatever he's planning, he's going to try to complete it before we can stop him. Kane's phone rang. It was Officer Martinez from the Millbrook Police Department. Agent Kane, we've got a problem. St. Mary's Episcopal Church just called. They're missing 23 children from their youth group. Kane felt his blood turn to ice. Missing how? They were supposed to be at a special evening service in the church basement. When the parents went to pick them up, the basement was empty. There's no sign of struggle, no indication of where they went. How long ago? About 2 hours. Right around. The time you detected movement at the hospital. Kane looked at the building with new horror. He's got them. He's got all of them, Agent Kane. Martinez's voice was shaking. There's something else. We found a note in the church basement. It says the shepherd has gathered his flock for the final offering. 23 lambs will be preserved in innocence. The work will be complete by dawn. Kane checked his watch. It was 9:30 p.m. They had less than 9 hours to save 23 children from a madman who believed he was saving their souls. Chen, get me a floor plan of that hospital. Contact the tactical team. We're going in. As the rain intensified, Kane stared at the building where Dr. Simon Thorne was preparing to perform his greatest act of twisted mercy. Somewhere in that maze of corridors and abandoned rooms, 23 children waited for salvation or death. The only question was whether. Kane and his team could reach them in time. The basement of Millbrook State Hospital stretched out before Gillette. Before Kane, like the bowels of hell itself, emergency lighting cast sickly green shadows on the walls. And the air tasted of mold and something else, something medicinal and wrong. Kane moved through the corridor with tactical precision. Drawn, Chen behind him, and the FBI tactical team spread out in formation. They'd been searching the building for 2 hours, clearing room after room, finding nothing but empty spaces and the lingering scent of antiseptic. He's had 3 years to prepare this place, Chen whispered. He could have the children anywhere. Kane paused at a junction in the corridor, listening. The building was old, and every footstep echoed like a gunshot. But beneath the sounds of their movement, he heard something else, singing. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably the voices of children. This way, he said, following the sound, down a corridor that led deeper into the building's foundation. The singing grew louder as they approached a heavy wooden door marked chapel. Kane could make out the words now at him he recognized from his childhood. Jesus loves me. Kane positioned his team on either side of the door, then slowly turned the handle. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The hospital's former chapel had been transformed into a macabre sanctuary. Candles flickered from every surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls. At the front of the room, Dr. Simon Thorne stood before a makeshift altar, his back to the door. He was dressed in surgical scrubs, but over them he wore what looked like a priest's vestments and arranged in the pews before him. 23 children sat in perfect rows, their voices joined in innocent song. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, all dressed in their church clothes, all singing with the kind of trust that only children possessed. Kane's blood ran cold when he realized what he was seeing. The children weren't restrained or frightened. They were participating willingly. Whatever Thorne had told them, whatever lies he'd fed them, they believed they were part of a religious service. Dr. Thorne, Kane called out, his voice steady despite the horror of the scene. FBI, step away from the children. Thorne turned slowly, and Kane saw madness burning in his eyes like fever. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. Agent Kane, I presume. I've been expecting you, he gestured to the children, who had stopped singing and were now looking back at the FBI agents with curiosity rather than fear. Beautiful, aren't they? So pure, so innocent, so ready for salvation. Let them go, Doctor. This ends now. Thorne smiled, and Kane saw that his teeth were stained red. Oh, but it's only just beginning. Do you know what I've discovered in my years of medical practice? Children are the only truly innocent souls left in this world. They haven't been corrupted by greed, by lust, by the thousand small evils that poison adult hearts. Kane kept his weapon trained on Thorne while scanning the room for threats. The children were too close to the killer. Any sudden movement could result in casualties. These children trust the world, Thorne continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. They believe in goodness and kindness and hope. Do you know what happens to that trust, Agent Kane? The world breaks it. The world teaches them that people lie, that love fails, that hope is foolish. That's part of growing up, Kane said, trying to keep Thorne talking while his team maneuvered. Into position. Learning to navigate the world's complexities. Thorne laughed, the sound echoing off the chapel walls. You mean corruptions? You mean the slow death of everything pure and good in the human soul? I've seen it. Happen thousands of times. Innocent children become broken adults, their souls scarred by disappointment and betrayal. One of the children, a girl of about 10, turned to look at Thorne. Are we going to sing more songs? Thorne's expression softened as he looked at her. Soon, little lamb. Very soon, you'll be singing with the angels. Kane felt his finger tighten on the trigger. Doctor, these children have families who love them, parents who are worried sick about them. Let them go home. Home. Oh. Thorne's eyes blazed with religious fervor. Home to what? To a world that will teach them to hate and fear and doubt, to a society that will poison their innocence with violence and pornography and materialism? I'm offering them something far better. You're offering them death. I'm offering them preservation. Eternal innocence. It's a chance to remain pure forever. Thorne moved toward the altar, where Kane could now see medical equipment arranged with surgical precision. In 20 minutes, these children will be with God, their souls untainted by the world's corruption. They'll thank me for saving them. Kane realized with horror that Thorne actually believed what he was saying. Mind, he was performing an act of supreme love. "Children," Thorn called out, his voice warm and reassuring. "Would you like to play a special game? A game that will make you feel very peaceful and happy?" Several of the children nodded eagerly. Kane watched as Thorn picked up a syringe from the altar. The same sedative he'd used on the families. "Stop," Kane shouted. But Thorn was already moving toward the first child. The chapel exploded into chaos as the tactical team moved in. But Kane knew with sick certainty that they might be too late. In the flickering candlelight, with 23 innocent lives hanging in the balance, Dr. Simon Thorn prepared to perform his final, most terrible act of mercy. The syringe glinted in the candlelight as Thorn approached the first child, a boy of maybe 7. With freckles and a gap-toothed smile, the child looked up at him with complete trust, the kind of faith that only the innocent possess. "Hold still, little lamb," Thorn whispered, his voice gentle as a lullaby. "This will only hurt for a moment, and then you'll feel nothing but peace." Didn't hesitate. Couldn't risk a shot with the children so close, so he did the only thing he could. He launched himself across the chapel, tackling Thorn just as the needle was about to pierce the boy's arm. The two men hit the floor hard, the syringe skittering across the stone tiles. Thorn was smaller than Kane, but desperation and madness gave him strength. He clawed at Kane's face, his fingernails drawing blood. "You don't understand," Thorn screamed, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. "I'm saving them, preserving their innocence." Kane pinned Thorn to the ground, but the doctor twisted like a snake, reaching for another syringe from the altar. The children watched in confusion and growing fear as their gentle guardian transformed into something wild and dangerous. "Get the children out of here," Kane shouted to his team. Chen and the tactical officers began herding the confused children toward the door, but they moved slowly, reluctant to leave what they'd been told was a religious service. Thorn broke free from Kane's grip and scrambled toward the altar. His surgical scrubs were torn, his priest's vestments hanging in tatters, but his eyes still burned with religious fervor. "You're too late," he cried, grabbing a larger syringe, this one filled with something that wasn't sedative. The liquid. Inside was dark, almost black. "I can't save them all. I'll save as many as I can." Kane realized with horror that the syringe contained something lethal. Thorn wasn't planning to sedate the children anymore. He was planning to kill them, quickly, before they could be stopped. Thorn lunged toward a group of children who hadn't yet reached the door. Kane drew his weapon, but the angle was wrong to many innocent lives in the line of fire. That's when 10-year-old Sarah Henderson, the daughter of the family they'd failed to save, stepped forward. She'd been sitting in the front pew, and now she looked up at Thorn with eyes that held more understanding than any child should possess. "You killed my family," she said quietly. Kane's blood ran cold. Yes. Sarah Henderson was supposed to be dead, but here she was, alive, speaking to her family's killer with a calmness that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Thorn stopped, the syringe trembling in his hand. "Sarah, but ... but you were saved. You were preserved in innocence." "You were. With your family I hid," Sarah said simply. "I hid in the basement when you came to our house. I watched what you did to Mommy and Daddy and Tommy. I watched you make them drink the red stuff." Thorn's face went white. In his madness, he'd never considered that one of his saved souls might have escaped. The perfect symmetry of his divine. "Mission was broken, you ... You saw," he whispered. "I saw everything, and I know what you really are." Sarah's voice was steady, but Kane could see tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're not a shepherd. You're just a man who hurts people." Truth hit Thorn like a physical blow. Kane saw the exact moment when the delusion cracked, when the religious fervor gave way to the devastating realization of what he'd actually done. The syringe fell from his trembling fingers. "No," Thorn moaned, falling to his knees. "No, I was saving them. I was preserving their innocence. I was murdering children," Kane said, moving closer with his weapon trained on the broken man. "You were killing families. You were destroying the very innocence you claimed to protect." Thorn looked around the chapel at the frightened children, at the FBI agents, at the flickering candles that suddenly seemed more like a funeral pyre than a sacred space. The weight of his actions, stripped of delusion and religious justification, crushed him. "I heard God's voice," he whispered. "I heard him telling me to save them." "You heard your own madness," Kane replied. "And now it's over." But as Kane moved to arrest Thorne, the doctor's hand closed around one final syringe, the one he'd prepared for himself. Before anyone could stop him, he plunged it into his own neck. The shepherd, he gasped, his eyes already losing focus, must follow his flock. Dr. Simon Thorne, the man who believed he was saving souls, collapsed in the chapel he'd created for his twisted salvation. The children he'd planned to preserve watched in silence as their captor's own delusions finally consumed him. 3 weeks later, Kane sat in his office at the FBI field office in Richmond, staring at a stack of case files that would never fully explain what had happened in Millbrook. The official reports were complete. Dr. Simon Thorne, former trauma surgeon, had killed 4 families across 4 states before being stopped during an attempted mass murder at an abandoned psychiatric hospital. But the reports couldn't capture the true horror of what they'd witnessed. He couldn't explain how a man dedicated to saving lives had become so twisted that he saw murder as mercy. They couldn't quantify the innocence that had been lost, or the families that had been destroyed. Dr. Vance knocked on his door and entered without waiting for permission. She looked as exhausted as Kane felt. "The final autopsy report on Thorne came back," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Massive amounts of antipsychotic medication in his system, but not the kind he should have been taking. He was self-medicating with drugs that actually made his condition worse." Kane looked up from the files. He was making himself crazier, possibly on purpose. The wrong medication would have intensified his delusions, made the voices more vivid, more compelling. He may have wanted to hear God's voice more clearly. Kane thought about the man he'd tackled in that chapel, the religious fervor burning. In his eyes, like fever, really believed he was saving them. The most dangerous killers always do. They don't see themselves as monsters. They see themselves as heroes of their own twisted stories. Kane's phone rang. It was Agent Walsh. "David, I wanted to give you an update on the children from the hospital. They're all physically fine, but the psychological trauma is going to take years to heal. So most of them still don't understand what almost happened to them." "What about Sarah Henderson?" "She's the one I'm most worried about. She's been through more than any 10-year-old should have to endure. She's living with her aunt now, but she's not speaking much. Just draws pictures of her family over and over." Kane closed his eyes. Sarah Henderson had saved 23 lives by confronting Thorne with the truth of his actions, but the cost to her own innocence was immeasurable. "There's something else," Walsh continued. "We found Thorne's journal in the hospital. He'd been planning this for 3 years. But David, this wasn't meant to be his final act. He was planning to move on to other towns, other communities. We may have stopped him before he killed hundreds of people." Kane felt a chill. "How many other towns?" He had a list. 17 communities across the country, all with the same demographic profile as Millbrook. All with families he'd identified as worthy of salvation. Kane looked out his window at the Virginia countryside, thinking about all the families who would never know how close they'd come to destruction. Children who would grow up normally, experiencing both the joys and sorrows of life, their innocence, intact until the world naturally taught them its harder lessons. "The families we lost," Kane said quietly, "the Hartwells, the Hendersons, the others, they were just the beginning." "Yes, but we stopped him. Saved the children in that chapel, and we saved all the families he never got to target." After Walsh hung up, Kane sat in the silence of his office, thinking about the nature of innocence and corruption. Thorne had been obsessed with preserving purity, but he'd destroyed more innocence than any natural process of growing up ever could. The children who'd survived would carry the memory of that chapel for the rest of their lives. They'd learned too early that the world contained monsters, that trust could be weaponized. Even those who claimed to protect them might be the very people they needed protection from. But they'd also learned that heroes existed, that people, like Kane and his team, would risk everything to save them. That innocence once lost could still be defended. That even in the darkest places, light could still find a way in. Kane picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never called. "Sarah, this is Agent Kane. I was wondering if you'd like to have ice cream sometime." "I know a place that makes really good sundaes." The silence stretched so long that Kane thought she might not answer. Then in a voice so small it was almost a whisper, she said, "Can we get the kind with sprinkles?" "And get any kind you want," Kane replied. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Outside his window, the sun was setting over the Virginia hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was a beautiful ending to a terrible story. Reminder that even after the darkest nights, morning always came. The shepherd's game was over. The lambs were safe. And somewhere in the distance, Kane could hear the sound of children laughing. As they played in the fading light, their innocence intact, their futures bright with possibility. That was the end of part 1. The shepherd's game continues in part 2, The Lamb's Revenge. If you enjoyed this part, be sure to like and subscribe so I can improve and make more videos just like this. Thanks. See you in the next video. Die.